My sister's wedding speech was supposed to be about love and new beginnings. Instead, it became the nuclear bomb that destroyed my entire life in front of 200 guests. Before I talk about my beautiful bride, my sister Natalie said, raising her champagne glass as the reception hall fell silent, I need to address something that's been eating at me for 15 years. I was sitting at the head table, wearing my maid of honor dress, completely unprepared for what was about to come out of my sister's mouth. My husband Blake sat beside me, his hand warm on my knee, both of us smiling expectantly. We had no idea we were about to become the center of the most explosive family scandal in wedding history. 15 years ago, Natalie continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking, my sister Autumn married a man she thought was Blake Morrison, a software engineer from Portland. But Blake Morrison died in a car accident in 2008, a year before they met. But what I found that night changed everything. The reception hall went silent except for the clink of someone's champagne glass hitting the floor. I felt Blake's hand tighten on my knee, felt every eye in the room turn toward our table. The man sitting next to my sister, Natalie said, looking directly at Blake, is actually Blake Sinclair, a con artist who has been living under a dead man's identity for 15 years. He's wanted by the FBI for fraud across 4 states. My vision started to tunnel. Blake Morrison, my husband of 14 years, the father of our twin 12-year-old sons, was not Blake Morrison. Natalie, I whispered, but my voice was lost in the growing murmur of shocked guests. Blake stood up so abruptly his chair fell backward. This is insane, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but... Sit down, Blake Sinclair, said a voice from the back of the room. 3 men in dark suits were walking toward our table, and the way they moved told me everything I needed to know. FBI. My intuition was right, even if it hurt. The lead agent reached our table and pulled out a badge. Blake Sinclair, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Everything happened in slow motion after that. Blake being handcuffed in front of 200 wedding guests, the agent reading him his rights while my sons watched in horror from the kids' table. The shocked faces of friends and family who had known Blake Morrison for over a decade. But the worst part was Blake's face as they led him away. Not confusion, not outrage, not the shocked innocence of a man wrongly accused. Resignation. The face of a man whose 15-year performance had finally come to an end. From that moment on, nothing felt the same. Mom? My son Carter's voice cut through the chaos. He and his twin brother Logan were standing beside our table, still wearing their junior groomsmen suits, their faces pale with confusion. What's happening to Dad? How do you explain to 12-year-old boys that their father isn't who they think he is, that their entire lives have been built on a lie so comprehensive that even their last name might be fake? I don't know, baby, I said, pulling both boys close. I don't know anything right now. Natalie approached our table, tears streaming down her face, still wearing her wedding dress. Autumn, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to do it this way, but the FBI said if I didn't help them, they'd arrest me as an accessory. You knew? I whispered. You've known this whole time? I found out 6 months ago. I hired a private investigator to do a background check on my fiancé, and he accidentally discovered Blake's real identity. When I took it to the police, they told me Blake has been running cons for 20 years. And in that instant, my plan began to form. The reception hall was in chaos. Guests were pulling out phones, recording everything, probably already posting to social media. My perfect sister's perfect wedding had become a crime scene, and my perfect marriage had just been revealed as the most elaborate fraud in family history. Mrs. Morrison, the FBI agent approached me, his expression sympathetic but professional. We're going to need to speak with you and your children. There are some things about your husband's activities that you need to understand. What kind of activities? The kind that put your family's safety at risk. Blake Sinclair isn't just a con artist, Mrs. Morrison. He's been using your marriage and your children as cover for criminal operations that span multiple decades. I looked around the reception hall, at the wedding decorations that had cost $30,000, at the guests who were already whispering and staring, at my sons who were clinging to me like I was the only stable thing left in their world. Agent Rodriguez. Agent Maria Rodriguez. Agent Rodriguez, are you telling me that my entire marriage has been a criminal conspiracy? Ma'am, we're going to need several hours to explain everything we've discovered about your husband's activities. But yes, your marriage was part of an elaborate long-term con that's been used to facilitate multiple federal crimes. As I stood in that reception hall, wearing a bridesmaid dress and holding my terrified children, I realized the most devastating truth of all. I hadn't just married a con artist. I had been the unwitting accomplice in my own deception for 15 years. And my sister's wedding day had become the day my entire life exploded. Let me tell you who I was before my sister's wedding turned me into the protagonist of a federal crime investigation. I was Autumn Morrison, or at least, I thought I was. 36 years old, mother to twin boys, owner of a successful children's bookstore in downtown Beaverton, Oregon. I was the woman who organized school fundraisers, coached youth soccer, and still believed that love could conquer anything. I was living what I thought was a beautiful, ordinary life, completely unaware that every single day of it had been choreographed by a professional criminal. Blake and I met 16 years ago at a coffee shop near Portland State University. I was 21, working on my education degree while managing the bookstore part-time. He was 28, charming and confident, with stories about his software development work that made him seem successful and stable. "You're going to change kids' lives with that bookstore," he said during our first conversation, watching me reorganize the children's section during my lunch break. "Books saved my life when I was a kid. Give children the right story at the right time, and you can change their whole world. Sometimes losing is how you win." We got married 2 years later in a ceremony that felt like something out of a fairy tale. Blake insisted on paying for everything: the venue, the flowers, my dress that cost more than I made in 3 months. When I asked how he could afford such an extravagant wedding on a software engineer's salary, he smiled and said he'd been investing smart and saving smarter. The twins arrived 5 years after that. Blake was an incredible father from day one, the kind of dad who knew every detail of his sons' lives, who never missed a soccer game or school play, who built elaborate Halloween costumes and read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. For 12 years, we were the family everyone envied. The couple that took dream vacations to places like Ireland and Japan. The parents who could afford to send our boys to private school, summer camps, music lessons. The family that lived in a beautiful house in the best neighborhood, drove reliable cars, and never seemed to worry about money. But sitting in Agent Rodriguez's government sedan, driving away from my sister's destroyed wedding, I began to understand that our perfect life had been funded by crime. But what I found that night changed everything. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Rodriguez said as we pulled into the FBI field office parking lot, "I need you to prepare yourself for some difficult information. Your husband has been using your family as cover for criminal activity that dates back to before you met him." "What kind of criminal activity?" "Identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges across multiple states. Blake Sinclair has been running long-term cons for over 20 years. Carter and Logan sat silently in the back seat, still wearing their junior groomsmen suits, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen them. They'd gone from excited wedding participants to confused crime victims in the space of one speech. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" Logan whispered. "No, baby. We didn't do anything wrong. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. How do you live with someone for 15 years without knowing they're a criminal? How do you share a bed, raise children, and build a life with someone whose entire identity is a lie? My intuition was right, even if it hurt. Inside the FBI building, Agent Rodriguez led us to a conference room where the scope of Blake's deception began to unfold. Photos, documents, timelines, evidence of a criminal career that spanned 2 decades and multiple identities. Blake Sinclair's real name is Brian Kelly, Agent Rodriguez explained, spreading photos across the table. He's originally from Detroit. He started running cons when he was 19. Small-scale stuff at first. Fake job interviews, fraudulent loan applications, romance scams. She showed me photos of Blake with different women in different cities. Different hair, different clothes, but the same smile that had charmed me 16 years ago. In 2005, he escalated to identity theft. He would find deceased men with good credit and clean records, then assume their identities. Blake Morrison was his longest-running persona because he married you. Why did marrying me help him? Because married men with children appear stable, trustworthy. It gave him credibility for larger cons. Banks, investors, business partners. They all trusted Blake Morrison because he had a wife and kids. From that moment on, nothing felt the same. The photos showed Blake at business meetings, charity events, community gatherings, all the places where he'd built his reputation as a successful, family-oriented member of the community. Your bookstore was part of it too, Agent Rodriguez said gently. Blake used your business accounts to launder money from his various schemes. The success you thought you'd built? It was funded by his criminal profits. I stared at financial records showing deposits that had nothing to do with book sales, amounts that dwarfed my legitimate income, flowing through my business accounts like I was running a major corporation instead of a small neighborhood bookstore. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Over the past 15 years? Approximately $2.3 million in fraudulent income that passed through accounts connected to your family. The number hit me like a physical blow. My beautiful bookstore, my son's private education, our family vacations, all of it funded by crimes I'd never even imagined. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Rodriguez said, we need you to understand that legally, you could be considered an accomplice to these crimes. And in that instant, my plan began to form. But I didn't know anything. That's what we need to determine. And that's why your cooperation is going to be crucial to your family's future. As I sat in that conference room, looking at evidence of my husband's secret life, I realized something that changed everything. I hadn't just been married to a con artist. I had been the most successful con he'd ever run. And now I had to figure out how to protect my children from the fallout of a deception so complete that it might destroy everything we'd ever believed about ourselves. The FBI kept us at the field office until midnight, going through 15 years of financial records, business transactions, and what they called lifestyle analysis. Agent Rodriguez showed me bank deposits I'd never seen, business partnerships Blake had never mentioned, and real estate investments made in names I didn't recognize. Your husband has been operating multiple personas simultaneously, she explained, spreading documents across the conference room table. Blake Morrison was just one of them. He's also been Robert Nash in Seattle, Michael Torres in San Francisco, and David Chen in Phoenix. The eyes can lie, but routine never does. Each fake identity had its own business, its own bank accounts, its own carefully constructed background. Blake had been living 4 different lives, traveling between cities, maintaining relationships and criminal enterprises I'd never imagined. But he was home every night, I said, trying to process the impossibility of what I was learning. He coached the boys' soccer team. He never traveled for work. Mrs. Morrison, your husband told you he worked remotely as a software consultant. That gave him the flexibility to travel extensively while maintaining the appearance of being a stay-at-home dad. All those times Blake had said he was working in his home office, all those client calls that required privacy, all those development deadlines that kept him busy while I handled the day-to-day parenting. He hadn't been writing code. He'd been coordinating criminal operations across the western United States. But what I found that night changed everything. "Mom," Carter said quietly from where he and Logan sat in chairs too big for them, "is Dad really a bad guy? How do you explain to 12-year-old boys that their father, the man who taught them to ride bikes, who helped with homework every night, who made pancakes shaped like their favorite cartoon characters, was a career criminal?" "Your father loves you very much," I said carefully, "but he made some very bad choices that hurt a lot of people." "Did he hurt us?" The question broke my heart because I didn't know the answer. Blake had given us a beautiful life, but he'd funded it through crimes that could destroy other families. He'd been a loving father, but he'd taught our children to live on stolen money. Agent Rodriguez showed me victim impact statements, elderly people who'd lost their retirement savings to Blake's investment cons, small business owners who'd been defrauded out of their life's work, young couples who'd had their identities stolen and their credit destroyed. My intuition was right, even if it hurt. "Mrs. Morrison, we need you to understand the scope of your husband's operation. This isn't just financial fraud. Some of his victims have suffered severe emotional trauma, lost their homes, even attempted suicide." Each victim statement was like a knife to the chest. Blake's crimes had real faces, real consequences, real human suffering that he'd hidden from us behind his perfect father persona. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Because we need you to cooperate with our investigation, and because we need you to understand that your husband is dangerous, not just to his victims, but potentially to your family. Blake would never hurt us. Blake Sinclair has demonstrated a willingness to destroy anyone who threatens his operation. When his previous identity was discovered in 2003, his girlfriend ended up in the hospital with injuries she claimed were from a car accident. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Blake, my Blake, who kissed my forehead every morning and read bedtime stories with silly voices, might be capable of violence. From that moment on, nothing felt the same. "Agent Rodriguez, what happens to us now?" "That depends on several factors. Your level of cooperation with our investigation, whether you can provide information about Blake's current operations, and whether we can establish that you were truly unaware of his criminal activities." Of course I was unaware. Do you think I would have stayed married to him if I'd known he was stealing from people? But even as I said it, I began to remember moments that should have been warning signs. The expensive gifts that appeared after Blake had been stressed about work. The way he discouraged me from hiring an accountant for the bookstore. The times he'd insisted on handling all our tax preparation personally. "Mrs. Morrison, we're going to need you to undergo polygraph testing to establish your credibility as a witness." "Polygraph testing?" "To verify that you weren't aware of your husband's criminal activities. If you pass, you'll be considered a victim and witness. If you fail..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. If I failed, I'd be considered an accomplice to 15 years of federal crimes. And in that instant, my plan began to form. By the time Agent Rodriguez drove us home at 1:30 a.m., I understood that my perfect life had been completely destroyed. Not just ended, destroyed. Our house, our cars, our bank accounts, even my bookstore could be seized as proceeds from criminal activity. But as we pulled into our driveway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The house was dark, but Blake's car was in the garage. "That's impossible," I said. "Blake was arrested at the wedding." Agent Rodriguez immediately called for backup. "Mrs. Morrison, Blake posted bail 3 hours ago. He's been released pending trial. My husband, the con artist, the federal fugitive, the man who might be dangerous, was inside our house, waiting for us to come home, and I had no idea what he was planning to do to protect his secret life, or what he might do to us if he thought we were going to expose him. Agent Rodriguez wouldn't let us enter the house until backup arrived. We sat in her sedan in our own driveway, watching our dark windows, waiting to see if the man I'd been married to for 15 years was going to come out peacefully, or if this was about to become a hostage situation. "Mom, I'm scared," Logan whispered, still wearing his groomsman suit from the wedding that felt like it had happened in another lifetime. "It's going to be okay," I said, but my voice shook. Nothing about this situation was okay. When 4 additional FBI vehicles arrived, Agent Rodriguez finally allowed us to approach the house. The agents went in first, weapons drawn, while my boys and I waited on the front lawn like refugees from our own life. But what I found that night changed everything. "Clear!" came the shout from inside. "He's not here." But Blake had been here. The evidence was everywhere. His home office had been stripped clean, computer gone, filing cabinets empty, safe opened and cleared out. His clothes were missing from our bedroom closet. Even personal photos had been removed from the walls. Blake Sinclair had systematically erased Blake Morrison from our house. "He's running," Agent Rodriguez said, examining the empty safe. "Whatever he left behind when he was arrested, he came back for." In our bedroom, I found an envelope on my pillow with my name written in Blake's familiar handwriting. Inside, a letter that made my hands shake. "Autumn. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. What happened at the wedding was inevitable. I've been living on borrowed time for 15 years. I know you have questions, and you deserve answers. But first, you need to understand that everything I told the FBI tonight was to protect you and the boys. I confessed to crimes you had no knowledge of, and I made it clear that you were as much a victim as anyone else. The man you married was real, even if his name wasn't. My love for you and Carter and Logan was the only honest thing in my life. I became Blake Morrison to run a con, but I stayed Blake Morrison because I fell in love with the life we built together. Agent Rodriguez will try to convince you to cooperate with their investigation. Do it. Tell them everything you know, which is nothing. Take the polygraph. Let them search everything. Your innocence is the only thing that will keep you and the boys safe. I've made arrangements. There's a safety deposit box at First National, box 847. The key is taped under the kitchen sink. Inside, you'll find clean money. My legitimate earnings from investments I made with early con profits. It's not much, but it should help you rebuild. Don't try to find me. Don't let the boys try to contact me. The life I'm going into now isn't safe for families. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I lied. I'm sorry I put you in danger. I'm sorry our sons have to grow up knowing their father was a criminal, but I'm not sorry I married you. You and the boys were the best thing that ever happened to me. Love always, Blake." My intuition was right, even if it hurt. Agent Rodriguez read the letter over my shoulder. "He's trying to protect you," she said. "That's actually good news for your legal situation." "How is any of this good news?" "Because it establishes that you weren't part of his criminal operation. Blake's confession and this letter are evidence of your innocence." But I didn't feel innocent. I felt like the biggest fool in criminal history. How do you live with someone for 15 years and not know they're a professional con artist? From that moment on, nothing felt the same. The next morning, while the boys slept late and exhausted, I went to the bank to access the safety deposit box Blake had mentioned. Inside, $50,000 in cash, investment statements showing legitimate accounts worth another $100,000, and a detailed letter explaining which money was clean and which assets the FBI would likely seize. Blake had been planning his exit strategy for months, maybe years. But he'd also been planning our survival. At home, I began my own investigation. Not of Blake's crimes. The FBI was handling that. but of the warning signs I'd missed, the red flags I'd ignored, the moments when I should have known something was wrong. Our wedding photos showed Blake with a confidence that seemed natural at the time, but now looked like performance. Our family vacations had been to places where Blake claimed no one would recognize him, which I'd thought was romantic but now realized was criminal necessity. Even our sons' names had been chosen strategically. Carter and Logan Morrison were common enough names to blend in anywhere, generic enough to avoid attracting attention. And in that instant, my plan began to form. Blake hadn't just been running a con on his victims. He'd been running a con on us too, carefully crafting a family that would provide perfect cover for his criminal activities. The FBI called that afternoon with news that changed everything. "Mrs. Morrison, we've been monitoring Blake's known accounts and contacts. He's not just running from our investigation. There's evidence that some of his victims have hired private investigators to track him down." "What does that mean?" "It means your husband isn't just avoiding federal prosecution. He's running from people who want revenge." "Are we in danger?" "We don't know yet. But Mrs. Morrison, some of Blake's victims have lost everything: their life savings, their homes, their families. People that desperate can be extremely dangerous." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Blake's letter hadn't just been a goodbye. It had been a warning. We weren't just dealing with the collapse of our marriage and the exposure of 15 years of lies. We were potentially dealing with people who blamed us for their suffering and might want to make us pay for Blake's crimes. The con artist's wife was about to become a target. The first victim showed up at my bookstore 3 days after Blake disappeared. Margaret Chen, 73 years old, carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Are you Autumn Morrison?" she asked, standing in front of my children's book display like she was delivering a formal indictment. "Yes," I said, though something in her tone made me want to deny it. "Your husband stole my retirement savings, $400,000, 25 years of careful planning and saving, gone because I trusted Blake Morrison with my investment portfolio. The eyes can lie, but routine never does." Margaret opened her folder and spread documents across my bookstore counter. Bank statements showing massive withdrawals. Investment records showing fictional companies that had never existed. Letters signed by Blake promising returns that had been mathematically impossible. "I lost my house," she continued, her voice steady but her hands shaking. "I had to move in with my daughter in California. I'm working as a grocery store clerk at 73 years old because your husband convinced me to put everything into his fake hedge fund." "Mrs. Chen, I'm so sorry, but I didn't know anything about Blake's business activities." "You didn't know your husband was traveling to Phoenix twice a month for 2 years? You didn't know he was using multiple phone numbers and email addresses? You didn't know he was driving a different car when he came to meet me?" Each question was like a physical blow, because the truth was, I had noticed things. Blake's mysterious client meetings that he never wanted to discuss. The second phone he claimed was for business emergencies. The way he sometimes came home smelling like different cologne or wearing clothes I'd never seen before. But what I found that night changed everything. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're angry, but I was a victim too. I had no idea." "A victim?" Margaret's voice rose, causing other customers to look over. "You live in a $500,000 house. Your children go to private school. You drive a luxury car. You built this successful business. All of it funded by money stolen from people like me." She was right, and we both knew it. Every book on my shelves, every improvement to my store, every advantage I'd given my children had been purchased with money Blake had stolen from vulnerable people. "What do you want from me?" I asked quietly. "I want my money back." "I don't have your money. The FBI has frozen all our accounts. They're seizing everything as proceeds from criminal activity." "Then I want justice." My intuition was right, even if it hurt. Margaret Chen was just the first. Over the next week, More victims found me. Robert Williams, who'd lost his small business when Blake's fake loan company disappeared with his collateral. Jennifer Reyes, whose identity had been stolen and used to open credit accounts she was still paying off 3 years later. Each victim brought documentation of Blake's crimes, proof of the systematic way he'd destroyed their lives while building ours. They didn't just want money back, they wanted acknowledgement, apology, some kind of accountability from the family that had benefited from their suffering. The hardest confrontation came from David Park, a man about Blake's age who brought his teenage daughter with him. "Your husband convinced me to invest my daughter's college fund," David said, his voice barely controlled. "Sarah was supposed to start at Stanford this fall. Now she's working at Starbucks, trying to save money for community college." From that moment on, nothing felt the same. Sarah Park was 17, the same age I'd been when I started working to pay for college. She stood behind her father, not angry like the other victims, just sad in a way that broke my heart. "I don't blame you," she said quietly. "My dad explained that you probably didn't know, but I wanted to see the family that got to use my college money." The accusation in her words was devastating because it wasn't accusation at all. It was just truth, delivered by a teenager who was mature enough to understand that life wasn't fair, but still young enough to be heartbroken about it. "Sarah, I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it. "If there was any way I could give you your money back—" "There is," David Park interrupted. "You could testify against your husband, help the FBI build a stronger case, make sure he goes to prison for long enough that he can't do this to other families." And in that instant, my plan began to form. "I'm already cooperating with the FBI investigation." "Cooperating isn't enough. We need you to be an active witness. Help them understand how Blake operated, how he convinced people to trust him, how he used your family as cover for his crimes." The request was reasonable, but it was also terrifying. Testifying against Blake meant acknowledging publicly that my entire marriage had been a fraud. It meant exposing my children to even more scrutiny and shame. It meant admitting that I had been either criminally naive or willfully ignorant for 15 years. But looking at Sarah Park, 17 years old, working at Starbucks instead of attending Stanford because my husband had stolen her future, I realized I didn't have a choice. "Mr. Park, I'll do whatever I can to help the FBI build their case." "Good, because there are 47 other victims, and most of them know where to find you." As David and Sarah Park left my bookstore, I understood that my confrontations with Blake's victims were just beginning. And each one would force me to face another piece of the truth I'd been avoiding. I might not have known the details of Blake's crimes, but I had lived very comfortably on the proceeds. The question wasn't whether I was legally innocent. The question was whether I could live with the moral weight of 15 years of stolen happiness. Agent Rodriguez called me in for a formal interview 2 weeks after Blake disappeared. This time, I came alone. The boys were staying with my parents, protected from the media circus that had erupted around our family. "Mrs. Morrison, we've completed our initial analysis of your husband's operation," she said, settling across from me in the same conference room where my world had first collapsed. "What we've discovered is more extensive than we initially thought." She spread photos across the table. Not just Blake's multiple identities, but an entire network of associated criminals, fake businesses, and coordinated cons that spanned the better part of 2 decades. Blake Sinclair wasn't working alone. He was part of a sophisticated criminal organization that specialized in long-term identity theft and investment fraud. But what I found that night changed everything. The photos showed Blake with people I'd never seen before, in cities where he'd supposedly never traveled, conducting business that looked nothing like software development. "This is Vincent Shaw," Agent Rodriguez said, pointing to a photo of Blake shaking hands with a well-dressed man in his 50s. "He's the head of the organization. Shaw recruits intelligent, charismatic people like Blake and trains them to assume false identities for long-term cons. How long has Blake been involved with these people? Since he was 19. Shaw essentially raised him in the criminal life. Blake's entire adult existence has been built around fraud. The revelation hit me like ice water. Blake hadn't fallen into crime after some life crisis or desperate moment. He'd been a professional criminal since before I was born. Mrs. Morrison, Vincent Shaw's organization specifically targets women like you for marriage scams. What do you mean, women like me? Educated, independent, trusting. Women who own businesses or have careers that can provide legitimate cover for money laundering. Women who are strong enough to manage families independently while their husbands travel for criminal activities. My intuition was right, even if it hurt. Agent Rodriguez showed me profiles of other women who'd been married to men in Shaw's organization. Teachers, small business owners, social workers. All of them intelligent, successful women who'd been carefully selected and systematically deceived. Blake didn't meet you by accident, Mrs. Morrison. Shaw's people scouted you for months before Blake made contact. The coffee shop where Blake and I had met. My favorite study spot, where I'd been going for 2 years before he ever approached me. He'd known my schedule, my habits, my weaknesses before he ever said hello. Everything about your relationship was planned? The initial contact was planned. But Mrs. Morrison, our psychological analysis suggests that Blake's feelings for you became genuine. That's actually why this operation lasted so long. Shaw's people usually abandon their false identities after 5 to 7 years. From that moment on, nothing felt the same. So Blake really loved me? We believe so. And that created a problem for Shaw's organization. Blake was supposed to disappear years ago, but he stayed because of you and the boys. He was living a double life, genuinely caring for his family while continuing to commit crimes for Shaw. Agent Rodriguez showed me financial records that painted a picture of Blake's internal conflict. Regular deposits from criminal activities, but also legitimate investments made in my name and the boys' names. Money he was stealing from victims, but also money he was trying to protect for us. Blake was trying to find a way out, she continued. For the past 3 years, he's been systematically moving money into clean accounts that Shaw couldn't access. He was planning to disappear with you and the boys. Why didn't he? Because Shaw doesn't let people leave, and because Blake had accumulated too much evidence of the organization's activities. He'd become a liability. And in that instant, my plan began to form. Agent Rodriguez pulled out a recording device. Mrs. Morrison, we need you to listen to something. This is a conversation between Blake and Vincent Shaw from 6 months ago. She pressed play, and Blake's familiar voice filled the room. I want out, Vincent. I want to take my family and disappear. You don't get to want out, Blake. You work for me until I say you're done. I've given you 15 years. I've made you millions of dollars. I want to retire. You want to retire? Fine. But your family stays. Insurance. That's not negotiable. Everything's negotiable when I'm holding the cards. You disappear, your wife and kids have accidents. You cooperate, they stay safe. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Shaw making increasingly explicit threats against me and the boys. Blake's voice became more desperate, more afraid, as he realized he was trapped between his criminal obligations and his desire to protect us. Mrs. Morrison, Agent Rodriguez said after the recording ended, Blake didn't just confess to protect you legally, he confessed to protect you physically. Shaw's organization doesn't leave loose ends. Are we still in danger? Shaw is in federal custody as of this morning, but his organization had dozens of operatives, and some of them are still at large. I stared at the photos of criminals who'd been part of Blake's world, people who might blame my family for Shaw's arrest, who might want revenge for Blake's cooperation with federal investigators. Agent Rodriguez, what happens now? Now you help us destroy the rest of Shaw's organization and hope that your husband's 15 years of evidence are enough to put these people away forever. As I looked at the scope of the criminal network Blake had been part of, I realized something that changed everything. My husband hadn't just been a con artist, he'd been a hostage to his own crimes, trapped in a criminal life he'd wanted to escape, but couldn't leave without destroying the family he'd grown to love. And now that family was inheriting the enemies he'd made and the debts he owed. That night, I sat in my empty house and made a list of everything I needed to do to protect my children and rebuild our lives. The house would be seized within the month. Our cars were already gone. My bookstore was under federal investigation, its assets frozen while the FBI determined how much of its success had been built on laundered money. But Agent Rodriguez had been right about Blake's letter. The safety deposit box contained not just money, but detailed documentation of which assets were legitimately earned and which were proceeds from crime. But what I found that night changed everything. Blake had been preparing for this collapse for years. Investment accounts in the boys' names, funded with money he'd carefully documented as clean. A small house in Oregon that had been purchased with legitimate income and was titled solely in my name. Even a college fund for the twins that the FBI couldn't touch because Blake had proven its source was legal. He'd been systematically protecting us while continuing to commit crimes, trying to build a safe foundation under a life built on lies. "Mom?" Carter's voice came from the doorway. He and Logan had come home from my parents' house earlier than expected, driven back by Logan's insistence that they needed to face the truth about Dad. "Yes, sweetheart. Are we going to be okay?" The question every mother dreads, especially when the honest answer is, "I don't know." My intuition was right, even if it hurt. "We're going to figure it out together," I said, pulling both boys onto the couch beside me. "We're going to have to make some big changes, but we're going to be okay." "Are we poor now?" Logan asked with the directness of a 12-year-old. "We're not rich anymore," I said honestly. "But we're not poor. We'll have enough to get by while I figure out how to start over." "Do we have to change schools?" Carter asked. "Probably. The house we're living in belongs to the government now, and your private school costs more than I can afford." From that moment on, nothing felt the same. The boys absorbed this information with a maturity that broke my heart. They'd grown up faster in the past 2 weeks than most children do in years. "Mom," Logan said quietly, "do you think Dad really loved us?" The question I'd been asking myself every day since the wedding. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. "I think Dad loved us very much. I think he made terrible choices, but I don't think his love for us was fake." "Then why did he lie about everything?" "Because sometimes people get trapped in bad situations and they don't know how to get out without hurting the people they love." It was an oversimplification, but it was also true. Blake had been 19 when he joined Shaw's organization, barely older than the boys were now. He'd spent his entire adult life in a criminal world, and by the time he wanted out, the cost of escape was higher than he could pay. And in that instant, my plan began to form. That week, I made the hardest decisions of my life. I met with a realtor about selling the small house Blake had bought legally. It would give us enough money to rent an apartment and survive for about a year while I figured out how to rebuild my career. I enrolled the boys in the local public school, explaining to confused administrators why 2 children from expensive private education were suddenly transferring mid-semester. I applied for jobs, not in children's literature, which had been tainted by association with Blake's crimes, but in basic retail and office work that could pay bills while I reconstructed my professional reputation. Most importantly, I scheduled family counseling sessions. Carter and Logan needed professional help processing the trauma of discovering their father was a criminal, and I needed help figuring out how to rebuild their sense of security and trust. "Mrs. Morrison," Dr. Sarah Kim said during our first session, "the boys are going to struggle with identity issues. When a parent's entire identity is revealed to be false, children often question their own sense of self. What can I do to help them? Consistency, honesty, and help them understand that their father's choices don't reflect on them or their worth. But the hardest conversation came when Carter asked me directly, "Mom, how do we know you're not lying to us too?" But what I found that night changed everything. The question cut deeper than anything the FBI had asked. Any accusation Blake's victims had made, any judgment from neighbors or friends who now viewed our family with suspicion. "You don't know," I said honestly. "Trust has to be rebuilt. I can't prove to you that I'm telling the truth. I can only show you through my actions, day after day, until you believe me again." But how do we know anyone is telling the truth about anything? It was the existential crisis of children whose reality had been completely shattered. If Dad could lie about everything for 15 years, how could anything be trusted? "We don't," I said, "but we have to choose to trust people anyway, because the alternative is being alone, forever." As I tucked the boys into their beds that night, possibly for the last time in the house they'd called home for 8 years, I made them a promise. I will never lie to you about anything important, ever again. Even if the truth is scary or sad or embarrassing, we're going to build a new life based on honesty, and it's going to be harder than the old life, but it's going to be real. "Promise?" Logan whispered. "I promise." And for the first time since Natalie's wedding speech destroyed our world, I felt like I was building something instead of watching everything collapse. It wasn't much, but it was honest. And honest was all we had left. The transformation happened slowly, in moments so small I almost missed them. It happened when I walked into a job interview at a local bookstore and told them exactly why I was applying. Not some fabricated story about seeking new challenges, but the truth about needing work because my previous business had been funded by criminal activity. They hired me anyway. It happened when I explained to Carter and Logan's new teachers why they were transferring schools mid-semester, giving them the whole truth so they could watch for signs of emotional distress in my children. The teachers offered extra support instead of judgment. It happened when I realized that living honestly, even when it was humiliating, felt better than living beautifully on stolen money. But what I found that night changed everything. 3 months after Blake disappeared, Agent Rodriguez called with news that changed our legal situation dramatically. "Mrs. Morrison, Blake's testimony has been crucial to our case against Shaw's organization. We've arrested 23 people and recovered over $15 million in stolen assets." "What does that mean for us?" "It means Blake's cooperation has established your innocence beyond any doubt. You won't face any criminal charges, and some of your seized assets may be returned." "What about the victims? Do they get their money back?" "Some of it. The Federal Recovery Program will return approximately 40% of the stolen funds to verified victims." My intuition was right, even if it hurt. 40% wasn't full restitution, but it was better than nothing. Margaret Chen would get back some of her retirement savings. Sarah Park might be able to afford a year at a state university. David Williams could restart his business with partial funding. But the news that really changed everything came a week later. "Mrs. Morrison, we've located your husband." Agent Rodriguez's voice on the phone was careful, professional, but I could hear something else underneath. Relief, maybe, or concern. Is he alive?" "He's alive. He's in federal protective custody in an undisclosed location. Shaw's organization had a contract on his life, but we got to him first." Blake was alive. After 4 months of not knowing whether he was dead or in hiding or planning some new con, he was safe in federal protection. "Can I see him?" "Mrs. Morrison, that's complicated. Blake has agreed to testify against everyone in Shaw's organization, which makes him a key witness in multiple federal trials. Contact with family members could compromise his security." From that moment on, nothing felt the same. "But he's my husband. the boy's father. I understand, but you also need to understand that Blake is still a federal fugitive. His cooperation doesn't erase 15 years of crimes. When the trials are over, he'll likely serve significant prison time. Prison time. The words hit me like cold water. Blake wouldn't just be absent from our lives. Temporarily, he'd be locked away for years, maybe decades. How long? Minimum 10 years? Possibly 20. White-collar crime at this scale carries serious sentences, even with cooperation. I sat in my small apartment, our new home, with its secondhand furniture and tiny bedrooms, and tried to process what this meant for the boys. Their father was alive, but he might as well be dead. He'd be in prison until they were adults, until they'd lived more of their lives without him than with him. And in that instant, my plan began to form. That evening, I gathered Carter and Logan for the hardest conversation we'd had since the wedding. Boys, Agent Rodriguez called today. She has news about your father. They both went very still, bracing for whatever was coming. He's alive and safe, but he's also going to prison for a long time because of the crimes he committed. How long? Carter asked quietly. Probably at least 10 years. Logan, who had been my optimistic child, the one who still believed Dad might come home and explain everything, started crying. Not the dramatic tears of a child's tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of someone processing permanent loss. Can we visit him? Carter asked. I don't know yet. Maybe after the trials are over. But what I found that night changed everything. Mom, Logan said through his tears, I don't want to visit him in prison. I want to remember him the way he was before we knew he was lying. The wisdom in that statement took my breath away. My 12-year-old son had just articulated something I'd been struggling with for months. We could choose to remember the Blake who built blanket forts and coached soccer and read bedtime stories with funny voices. Or we could let that memory be poisoned by the knowledge of his crimes. What do you want to do? I asked both boys. I want to write him a letter, Carter said. Tell him we're okay and we love him, but we can't have him in our lives anymore. I want to say goodbye, Logan added, but like, really goodbye. Forever goodbye. That night, we wrote letters to Blake together. Not angry letters or accusatory letters, but goodbye letters. Letters that acknowledged the love while accepting the loss. Letters that gave us permission to move forward without him. We mailed them through Agent Rodriguez, with instructions that Blake could read them but couldn't respond, because sometimes love means letting go completely. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is choose to stop waiting for someone who will never be able to come home. The silent power of moving forward. The federal trial began 18 months after Natalie's wedding destroyed our lives. I was called as a witness for the prosecution, tasked with explaining to a jury how Shaw's organization used families like mine as cover for criminal operations. Blake was there, sitting at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, looking older and thinner than I remembered. When our eyes met across the courtroom, he mouthed, "I'm sorry," and I nodded. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. The hardest part was testifying about our marriage while Blake sat 20 feet away, listening to me describe 15 years of deception to strangers. Mrs. Morrison, the prosecutor asked, did you have any knowledge of your husband's criminal activities? No, I said clearly. I believed Blake Morrison was a software consultant who worked from home. I believed our lifestyle was funded by his legitimate business success and smart investments. But what I found that night changed everything. But you must have noticed inconsistencies in his behavior? Yes. Blake traveled more than most work-from-home consultants. He was secretive about his business contacts. He discouraged me from being involved in our financial planning. Why didn't you investigate these inconsistencies? The question I'd been asking myself for 2 years. Because I trusted my husband. Because the lifestyle he provided was comfortable and secure. Because it's easier to ignore warning signs than to confront the possibility that your entire life is a lie. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal. Mrs. Morrison, you lived in a $500,000 house on the salary of a bookstore owner. Didn't that seem unrealistic to you? Blake told me he was very successful in software consulting and had made smart investments. You drove luxury cars, took expensive vacations, sent your children to private school. At no point did you wonder where this money was actually coming from. My intuition was right, even if it hurt. I trusted my husband to handle our finances. Trust or willful ignorance? The question hung in the courtroom like an accusation, because there was truth in it. I had chosen not to ask difficult questions because I was comfortable with the answers Blake provided. Both, I said finally. I trusted him, and I chose not to look too closely at things that didn't make sense. The defense attorney showed financial records to the jury, highlighting the impossibility of our lifestyle on legitimate income. Mrs. Morrison, you're an intelligent, educated woman. You run a successful business. Are you telling this jury that you genuinely believed your husband's story about software consulting? From that moment on, nothing felt the same. I'm telling this jury that when you love someone, you want to believe the best about them, even when evidence suggests you shouldn't. Even when that evidence should have been obvious to anyone paying attention? Yes. The admission felt like confessing to a crime I hadn't technically committed, but had somehow participated in through willful blindness. But the confrontation that changed everything happened during a recess, when Margaret Chen approached me in the courthouse hallway. Mrs. Morrison, she said, I wanted to thank you. Thank me? For what? For testifying honestly, for admitting that you chose not to see the warning signs. Most victims' families claim complete innocence. And in that instant, my plan began to form. Mrs. Chen, I was complicit through my ignorance. I lived comfortably on money stolen from people like you. Yes, you did. But you're also helping put these criminals away. You're making sure other families don't get destroyed the way ours were. She reached into her purse and pulled out a photo. This is my granddaughter, Emma. She's 8 years old. Because of your testimony and your husband's cooperation, the money I recovered from the federal program will pay for her college fund. The photo showed a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile, completely unaware that her future had been threatened and then restored by the criminal justice system. Mrs. Chen, I'm grateful some of your money was recovered, but I'm ashamed that it was stolen in the first place. Shame is appropriate, she said bluntly, but so is responsibility. You're taking responsibility by testifying, by helping the prosecution, by rebuilding your life honestly. As Margaret Chen walked away, I realized something that changed my entire perspective on the past 2 years. I couldn't undo the damage Blake's crimes had caused. I couldn't give back the comfortable years my family had enjoyed while his victims suffered. I couldn't erase my complicity through willful ignorance. But I could ensure that Shaw's organization was dismantled completely. I could help other families avoid what we'd been through. I could rebuild my life in a way that honored the victims rather than dismissing their suffering. When I returned to the witness stand that afternoon, the prosecutor asked one final question. Mrs. Morrison, what do you want the jury to understand about Shaw's organization? I want them to understand that these criminals don't just steal money. They steal trust, security, and the ability to believe in other people. They destroy families from the inside by turning love into a weapon. I looked directly at Vincent Shaw, sitting at the defendant's table with the arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. And I want them to understand that this organization is still dangerous. As long as these people are free, other families will be targeted, manipulated, and destroyed. The jury convicted Shaw and his associates on all counts. Blake received a reduced sentence for cooperation, 12 years in federal prison. And I walked out of that courthouse knowing that our confrontation with Shaw's organization was finally over. But our journey toward healing was just beginning. 2 years later, I'm sitting in my small apartment in Portland, watching Carter and Logan do homework at our secondhand kitchen table. And I'm genuinely happy for the first time since Natalie's wedding destroyed our old life. We're not the family we used to be. We're something entirely different. Something built on truth instead of lies. Struggle instead of stolen comfort. Carter is 14 now, starting high school at the local public school where he plays on the soccer team and works part-time bagging groceries to save money for college. Logan is 14 and has discovered a talent for writing. He's the editor of the school newspaper and wants to be a journalist, inspired by finding the truth behind the story. They've grown into young men who understand the value of honest work, the importance of asking difficult questions, and the difference between love and manipulation. But what I found that night changed everything. I work full-time at the independent bookstore where I was hired 2 years ago, and I've recently been promoted to manager. It's not the life I planned, but it's a life I've earned honestly, dollar by dollar, choice by choice. The boys and I live simply now. We rent our apartment, buy our clothes at thrift stores, vacation by camping in state parks. But every penny we spend is clean money, earned through legitimate work, and that makes even our small luxuries feel precious. People ask me if I'm angry at Blake, if I hate him for what he did to our family. The answer is complicated. I'm angry at the choices he made. I'm angry that he involved us in his criminal life without our knowledge. I'm angry that my children had to learn that their father was a liar and a criminal. But I'm not angry at him for loving us. Even though that love was embedded in deception, I believe it was real. Blake gave us 15 years of feeling cherished and secure, even if that security was built on stolen money. My intuition was right, even if it hurt. The hardest lesson I've learned is about my own complicity. I wasn't criminally responsible for Blake's crimes, but I was morally responsible for my willful blindness. I chose not to ask difficult questions because I was comfortable with easy answers. Never ignore what your heart tries to tell you. I tell groups of women at the financial literacy workshops I now volunteer for. If your lifestyle doesn't match your income, find out why. If your partner is secretive about money, demand transparency. The most important thing I teach is this: love without honesty isn't love at all. It's manipulation disguised as romance. Blake told me he loved me while lying about his identity, his career, his past, and his criminal activities. That wasn't love. It was performance designed to achieve criminal objectives. Real love would have meant choosing legitimate work over easy money. Real love would have meant protecting his family from criminal liability instead of using us as cover. Real love would have meant being honest about the dangers his choices created. From that moment on, nothing felt the same. We still get updates from Agent Rodriguez about Blake's situation. He's serving his sentence at a minimum security federal prison, participating in educational programs, working in the prison library. He writes letters to the boys occasionally, letters they can choose to read or not, with no pressure either way. Carter reads them. Logan doesn't. Both choices are valid. Blake will be eligible for parole in 8 years, when the boys are 22. They'll be adults then, capable of deciding for themselves whether they want a relationship with their father. I won't be making that decision for them, and I won't be part of whatever relationship they choose to have with him. My marriage to Blake ended the night Agent Rodriguez arrested him at Natalie's wedding, and in that instant, my plan began to form. Not a plan for revenge or justice, but a plan for building something honest from the wreckage of our deception. I've started dating someone new, David, a teacher at the boys' school who knows our entire story and loves us anyway. He's seen me at my most ashamed and vulnerable, knows about our financial struggles and family trauma, and chooses to be with us because of who we've become, not despite what we've been through. That's what real love looks like. honest, present, choosing each other with full knowledge of each other's flaws and histories. The boys like David, but they're not ready for me to remarry. And that's okay. We're building our new life slowly, honestly, with respect for everyone's healing process. Intuition is the truth we often silence. Self-love hurts at first, but it heals. Never ignore what your heart tries to tell you. These aren't just pretty words anymore. They're survival skills I learned by losing everything and discovering that everything I'd lost was built on lies anyway. If you're reading this and something in your relationship feels wrong, investigate. If your partner is secretive about money, demand transparency. If your lifestyle seems too good to be true, find out why. Your children are watching. They're learning what normal looks like from your choices. Make sure you're teaching them that love should feel safe, honest, and earned through legitimate means. Because in the end, nothing built on lies can last, but everything built on truth has the chance to grow into something beautiful. Even if you have to start over from nothing to get there. The truth sets you free. But first, it destroys everything that wasn't real. And sometimes, that destruction is the greatest gift you can give yourself and the people you love. Have you ever discovered that your entire life was built on someone else's lies? Share your story in the comments below. Every week, we share stories of women who found the courage to choose truth over comfort. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to join our community of women supporting women. Sometimes one story can save someone from years of deception. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.